Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2025, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I apologize. My 2-year-old is in the back having things he needs to share. I'd like to yield as much time as Mr. Miller will consume.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of my constituents in Western North Carolina who are angered and disgusted by what we've uncovered in Washington, and they have every right to be. Just yesterday, Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency uncovered that FEMA bureaucrats, holdovers from the last administration and against the Trump administration's wishes, tried to send $59 million payments to luxury hotels for illegal immigrants in New York City. They had the gall to try and sneak this under our noses, but I tell you, Mr. Speaker, not anymore. That's just the tip of the iceberg, though. Since late 2022, FEMA has spent over $1.4 billion of our hard-earned tax dollars on illegal immigrant housing, transportation, and services. That's $1.4 billion that could have been sent to disaster victims for rebuilding communities, for helping Americans in crisis, squandered on Biden's failed border policies. Meanwhile, Hurricane Helene devastated my district and tore through communities throughout Western North Carolina and Eastern Tennessee and other southern states. It took over 100 lives, wiped entire towns off the map, Mr. Speaker, and left thousands of American families homeless. They needed FEMA to step up and do their jobs. They needed help. And let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, but for the volunteers, but for the nonprofits, but for the churches, we would be looking at more loss of life, more loss of property, and more devastation. You know, shortly after I was sworn in, we had a winter storm. Tell me why during that winter storm were illegal immigrants given luxury hotel rooms while my constituents, American citizens, were calling my office asking and pleading for FEMA to help extend their hotel vouchers during a winter storm. They had nowhere to go home to, no heat, and Washington bureaucrats turned their backs on them. Thank God for President Trump, for Secretary Kristi Noem, and for DOGE, because this is getting turned around fast. But Mr. Speaker, I also want to show you something with this new poster that was just put beside me. This is a photo in Western North Carolina. This is a photo that I took, and this is what Biden's FEMA has ignored. I took this picture, as I say, 2 weekends ago in Chimney Rock. It's a very small town, but it gives you a glimpse of things. These people still need help to rebuild their homes, their businesses, as well as major bridges and roads. And this is just a snapshot of some of the damage that we have. We're still in the thick of it. And who showed up for us? Who showed back up? President Trump did. He made it his very first trip of his second term and one of his administration's biggest priorities. We've also been honored that Secretary Noem came here literally with a shovel and a wheelbarrow to help and to see what's happening. Just yesterday, Secretary Duffy visited us in Western North Carolina to see the damage along I-40 and pledged his support to ensure that I-40 gets rebuilt. And back even before the elections, Tulsi Gabbard came right after the storm with her nonprofit to bring everything from chainsaws to food. My friends, this is real leadership in action. But you know, when it comes to the federal government, President Trump is working very hard to root out corruption. He is making sure that the bureaucrats who betrayed the American people are held accountable. No more backdoor deals. No more slush funds for illegal immigrants. No more Washington elites ignoring the very people they are supposed to serve. It took President Trump to step in and fix this mess. And let me tell you, he is fixing it fast. We are already seeing money flowing back to the disaster relief where it belongs. We're cutting through the miles of bureaucratic red tape that delayed rebuilding efforts in North Carolina and Tennessee. We're making sure that no American is left behind ever again. But Mr. Speaker, this is just the beginning. Every single federal employee needs to hear this loud and clear. If you think you can keep wasting taxpayer dollars, if you think you can keep sneaking through payments for illegal immigrants, if you think you can ignore the suffering of the American people, your time is up. To the many bureaucrats who refuse to go to work, get out of your pajamas, show up at the office, start doing your jobs, or get doged. President Trump is leading. We are rebuilding, and we are making sure the American people, not illegal immigrants, not political insiders, not corrupt bureaucrats, but the American people are put first. This fight is not over by a long shot, but I promise you this, Mr. Speaker, we will win it, and with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Speaker, have a handful of things we need to do. First off, we had an oversight hearing. I chair oversight and Ways and Means a little while ago. And some of the things that get said around here, you just shake your head. So think about some of the things we're hearing from the press, from the Democrats, just panic-stricken. I need to actually walk the American people and our own staff through a little bit of facts and a little bit of the truth. We've done multiple presentations here saying, if you want to find waste and fraud, if you want to find programs that are misdesigned, other things that are going on, don't hire a bunch of lawyers, don't actually hire a bunch of investigators, hire data scientists. It turns out the truth is in the math. The math actually can tell you. So what was amusing is listening to some of the Democrats talk about, we don't want people seeing our data. Okay, maybe they should actually pay attention to current law. When you hear certain leftist groups, and most of these are actually fairly left, saying, we did an analysis of U.S. taxpayer data and blank, blank, blank is getting this. Well, actually, understand, and IRS is one of my things I oversee. For decades, apparently they've had data sharing models for researchers. And, not to give you the names, but, Harvard, University of Sydney. So they're not even domestic. Some are even out of the country. And yes, there's some rules. But the fact of the matter is this sort of hyperventilation going on around here. Have you wondered if it's because the ability to mine data is how you find bad acts? Look what the Wall Street Journal did over the last year in looking at Medicare. It wasn't about people's benefits. It was about actually people being defrauded in durable medical equipment. Other groups out there did data sharing, modeling, research agreements with CMS, and they found bad acts. So my simple question is, why has the left actually become terrified of data? Aren't they ones that preached to us in the previous years, what about science? Why don't you believe in science? Okay, guess what? Now science is actually being used to protect the U.S. taxpayers and America's future. Instead of being used to research things, to write papers to support a leftist cause, maybe they're actually now being used to actually find how the American people are being cheated. So when you hear them hyperventilating and reading the talking points from the Public Employees Union, maybe take a step backwards, deal with the fact that much of what is being put out is like clickbait, but understand these research agreements have been going on for years and years and years. And what's going on now, these folks are actually designated, I think, as special federal employees. So even a higher level of standard fiduciary responsibility. So look, this is just part of the thing around here. When you get something you don't like, or when you start to expose decades worth of bad acts, fight like hell, because the Public Employees Union functionally supports one side here. And we're just trying to find out what's actually going on. So one of the things I want to also accomplish in today's floor speech is, and I'm sorry, I know I'm a broken record, but I'm trying to break through. So let's actually deal with a couple things here. And before I go to the boards, I made the mistake of looking at some of the comments from last week's speech. You notice there's almost no people here. That's how it's supposed to be. If this room was full of people listening to an idiot like me give another speech, they're not working. They belong in their committees, in their working groups, in their offices, meeting with either constituents or their staff or are other people. This is where you come to actually have your final debate and vote. The vast, vast majority of work done in Congress isn't done in this room. It's done in the dozens of committee rooms and offices all over this campus. So when you see the room, stop falling for the clickbait. Why is the room empty? Because it's supposed to be. But one of the reasons you get behind this microphone is you're probably on 1,000 televisions around this campus and here in D.C. and around the country. This is your chance to talk to those staffers and help them understand how dire the math is and how intense the battle ahead of us is. How do you communicate with members that are maybe new to Congress and realize, hey, much of what you're being told may not be mathematically honest or true. So let's actually once again set the baseline. This one's about a year or so old. The numbers are actually slightly uglier. But you see the blue, non-defense and defense. Do you realize that's all a member of Congress gets to vote on? A member of Congress doesn't actually vote on the interest payments, the Social Security, the Medicare, Medicaid, other mandatory, because those are formulas now. Every dime a member of Congress votes on is borrowed money. And last year, every dime you voted on was borrowed money, and maybe $300–400 billion of what you didn't vote on was borrowed money, because we actually spent more or borrowed more than every dime of what we call discretionary, and defense is discretionary. Remember, in today's world, Social Security is the number one spend. It's about 1.4, 1.5. Medicare is number two. Interest is number two. Interest is number two. Medicare is number three, and defense is actually number four. So the next time you have some brain trust saying, you know, if we just cut defense, sure, I'm sure there's efficiencies that we may find in defense. And I've been pushing for this, my third Congress in a row, trying to get an AI audit because the Pentagon has failed for 8 years an audit. It's unauditable is the report we get back. So use AI at least to go through and stack the asset list, because you can't audit it if you don't know where the trucks are and other things. And in the security areas, fine, you do human auditing of those. Help us, because it's finally actually risen to the surface of people saying, hey, maybe technology can help us save our society and our future and our economy. So when you take a look at what really goes on here in Congress, you got to understand your government is functionally an insurance company with an army. And almost 100% of the next 10 years of borrowing is interest and Medicare. And yet we're terrified to tell the public the truth. It's math. The math will win. But we've got to stop being fearful. And for those of you who, I'm going to show some of these, stop saying crazy stuff. You know, if your mission in life is to fill out comments or put out things or go on X and this and that and say things because you're basically your life mission is to be clickbait, don't you care enough about this republic to tell the truth of the scale? It's debt, deficit, and demographics. And you have a country, we have a country, that in 8 years, less than 8 years now, will have more deaths than births. We have a shortage of young people. And it really screws up the long-run math and the ability to be productive, the ability to actually raise wages, all those things. And that's why there are ways to make this work. We just have to do hard things, and you see how difficult it is to even have an honest conversation about the math around here. Look, I showed this last week. I'm only going to do it for a second. But for those people that run around this campus saying, let's just use current policy because that way I don't have to deal with the actual telling someone no. Baseline, by the end of this fiscal year, CBO says we'll be at $37.2 trillion in borrowed money. If then CBO tells us over the next 9 budget years, 10 calendar years, we're going to borrow another $22 trillion. 37 trillion, another 22, and that if we were actually going to do the expiring tax provisions without finding a way to pay for them, that's $5.5 trillion, and then there's another $1.3 trillion of interest on top of that, and then many of the president's priorities are another $8 trillion when you add in the interest. You're functionally at $74 trillion of borrowing in the next 9 budget years. You basically have doubled U.S. debt. Is that really what's going on here? It took you 100 or 240 years to get where we're at. And once again, for a lot of people listening, those are the gross numbers because we borrow from the trust funds. But the other problem you actually have to have if you really want to geek out is by the end of this budget window, so in the next 8 years, 9 years, the trust funds are almost empty. One of our models basically says in mid-2033, the Social Security Trust Fund is empty. And it's not because someone stole your money. It was demographics. We haven't had enough young workers. And Social Security was always designed as a pay-as-you-go system. And the money that comes out of the Social Security Trust Fund and is loaned to Treasury, Treasury pays an interest. And actually, in the past, it's actually been a little above even some of the market interest you would have gotten. Problem is, every single month, Treasury gets a little note from Social Security saying, hey, we got our FICA tax collections. It's not enough for all the checks going out the door. Treasury, we want some cash. And so they cash in their what they call special, let's call them special T-bills. And because the brain trust in this place decided in lame duck that we were going to extend some additional Social Security benefits without paying for them, we actually shortened the life of the Social Security Trust Fund. Some of the math in 2033 looks like the trust fund will be gone. And if we don't fix it, we double senior poverty in America. This is the morality of this place. And the Democrats right now are writing an ad to attack an idiot like me for telling the truth. Because they care so much more about winning the next election than doubling senior poverty in America. They're going to try to scare the hell out of you instead of stepping up and saying, here's how you do it. And understand, 2034, 2035, when you have a full year and the trust fund and Social Security is gone, we calculate that's like $600 billion a year. So think about what we're fighting over here is, it may be $400 billion a year to extend the tax policy so people's taxes don't go up. But by the end of this window, you got another $600 billion a year to deal with. And it gets worse every single year. And that's not even dealing with the fact that a couple of years outside the budget window, the Medicare Part A trust fund is also empty. Is this place capable of dealing with difficulties? And for everyone out there, when your reaction is, well, just raise taxes. I've done it a half a dozen times on the floor, so the staff was telling me everyone that watches, the 6 people that watch this are bored with it. Go on the Manhattan Institute's website. I think it's Riedel, has a great article from a year ago, and he took all the tax hiking policies that have been functionally offered by the Democrats and scored them and said, here's the economic effects, here's what you get. This is the tax the rich, okay? Everyone over $400,000. And at the end, the calculation came out to you get about 1.5% of GDP. Okay, yay! We're going to borrow close to 7% of the entire economy this year. Does anyone see a math problem? When your default is, well, we're going to tax rich people more. Okay. It doesn't get you close to where you have to be. And if that chart I just showed you a moment ago, if we were to do these things without offsets, in 9 budget years, we're no longer borrowing about 7% of the entire economy. We're borrowing close to 9.2% of the entire economy. And it's not popular because, the folks out there want their feelings satiated and don't own calculators. I'm sorry, I know I'm being a bit of a jerk, and I'm just tired of dealing with lunacy. The primary driver of debt is demographics. So what happens if we can clean up ourselves? What happens if we're able to squeeze waste and fraud and find more modern ways that are more compassionate, more efficient to actually deliver the benefits to our brothers and sisters? We're actually seeing numbers. It could be, just thought experiment. We've been working on lists after lists after lists after lists of things you could modernize, reduce spending, and never cut someone's benefits, never cut their services. We have one project we're doing in our office. How many in Medicare and Medicaid and Indian Health Services and DOD and VA, how many duplicative scans are there? I mean, how many people go get an MRI, an X-ray, an ultrasound, and do you take that and then immediately attach it to someone's phone so the scan is mobile with them? We're seeing numbers where it's billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars being spent in duplicative scans. Is that cutting someone's service? Of course it isn't. Now, the lobbyists get upset because they make money on how many times, or at least their clients do. But I need you to think about how you modernize to do it better, faster, and cheaper, and more compassionate. We've done entire presentations here on the floor over the years trying to demonstrate that maybe the most moral thing we could do as a government is actually help people to be healthier. If we're seeing data that says 5% of the population with multiple chronic conditions are over half of all healthcare spend, what would happen if we actually focused on helping them be cured? If diabetes is 33% of all U.S. healthcare spending, should we actually think about that? If it's over $600 billion, 16% of U.S. healthcare by people crashing, not having a stroke because they didn't take their calcium inhibitors, or things of that nature, are the things we can do to help our brothers and sisters be healthier. And it turns out, a year ago, the Joint Economic Economists actually did a study that obesity in America may be an additional $9.1 trillion in healthcare over the next 10 years. Turns out that becomes the number one spend in the U.S. government. How do we make our brothers and sisters healthier so they can participate in the economy? Maybe they can actually have families. Maybe they, and there's suddenly this awakening in America, and it's not Republican or Democrat. I would argue it's just moral. We want our brothers and sisters to not only live longer, but more vibrantly. So are we willing to do very difficult things in farm policy and nutrition policy and how we deliver health services? It's worth thinking about, but as being in this stupid town, instantly the partisan rage is, oh, how's that going to get me elected? How am I going to use it as a wedge to beat the crap out of the other side? Maybe the morality of helping our brothers and sisters and not having this country be crushed in debt when the bond market is the most influential group in America today, not members of Congress. So let's actually take a quick look. If we were I'm trying to find the nicest way to say this. If we were just to do this TCJA extensions, which I believe we need to do, we're not going to raise taxes on working people, but we need to find a way to pay for it. Because it's not only the $5.5 trillion that CBO is now scoring if you did it to 2035, it's the $1.3 trillion financing costs of doing that. That's the interest. How about no tax on overtime pay? Okay, it's the passion of the president. But we need to come up with $3 trillion to cover that cost over 10 years. And if we don't, it adds another $700 billion of interest costs. If we do no tax on Social Security, that functionally comes out to almost $1.8 trillion. And almost all that money goes to Social Security and Medicare. Well, we got to find a way to cover that if we're not going to have tax on Social Security. How about SALT for the folks in California and New York who are basically saying they will not vote to extend the tax policy unless they get something for their areas, Okay, well, that could actually be another 1.2 trillion over the 10 years, and another $300 billion in interest if we don't pay for that. No tax on tips. Actually, turns out that one's actually fairly easy. It may be 0.6 trillion, so $600 billion over 10. Our math is a little higher, but that's the number we've been given. You got to understand, everyone has these wish lists. The president, members of Congress, our constituents, everyone wants something. Great. We need to look at the fact of how does it help the society grow economically, because prosperity is moral, and how do we pay for it in a way, because if we keep pushing up the U.S. debt, I showed a couple weeks ago that if we were to make the debt markets nervous, a single point of interest, a single point over the next 10 years costs the average American family $30,000, because you'd have higher car loan, higher home loan, higher credit card, higher student loans, everything else around you. You got to think about it. There's no free option here. You need to do the data to find out where there's bad acts, where there's things we can make more efficient. Then we're going to have to make hard decisions here saying that policy is 20, 30 years out of date. We need to end that program, or we need to modernize it. Because if you don't, if we just do the expiring tax provisions and don't pay for them, understand in 9 budget years, interest alone is over $2 trillion a year, and that's on today's interest rates. So, Mr. Speaker, if you're one of the people like me who believe if we make the debt markets nervous and they start raising our interest rates, you're walking right into that thing they call a debt spiral. This is current policy if we just do it without paying for it. And that's assuming interest rates don't go up on us. I've shown in the past a chart that basically says if U.S. interest rates, and I said this last week and I need to drill it in so maybe someone hears it. If U.S. interest rates went up to a 6 handle, which we've been close before, in 9 budget years, 45% of all U.S. tax collections go just to interest. This isn't a game. This isn't a wish list of, I don't want to do difficult things. Do difficult things today, because if you blow this up, in the near future, it gets almost impossible to deal with. And the dystopian crap you'd have to do to the American people will make today's tough decisions look like a walk in the park. And look, I'm going to breeze through just because I find some of this fun. Okay, did you know a penny actually costs like 3 cents to make? Okay, great, get rid of them. I don't care. A nickel actually costs almost 9 cents. But you'll be happy, we make monies on dimes and quarters and half dollars. But these are tiny. I'm going to make an argument as I walk through these boards. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of little things. They really don't add up to much. And you should absolutely do them. But if you're the politician, if you're the press, if you're the staff, if you're the talking head on cable television, and you're saying, well, if we just got rid of pennies, we're going to balance the U.S. budget, stop saying insanity. Because one of the problems is when people like us, we go home, we talk to our voters, and they've heard these things saying, if you just got rid of the Department of Education, we'd be fine. And you show them the math, and they look at you like, well, I heard it on television. Please, I beg of you, take this seriously. There is a way to make this work. We just have to do really hard things. So let's take a look at this one. This is one of my favorite. So far, this is as of last Friday, I think there were 40,000 folks, according to the Wall Street Journal, who had said they'll take the early retirement. The reality of it, with the technology we have today, you could have a revolution in the federal workforce. You could dramatically change the number of people. How many law firms today actually have a fraction of the people they had 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, because of the use of technology. Why wouldn't you accept the same thing for your federal government? Remember, you're paying for this, but you got to understand the real math. If 40,000 federal workers, and I'm not actually even talking about the buyouts, that just their base salary, average salary $106,000, so do that times, and then we added in wages and benefits, times 40,000, it's 1 day of borrowing. On average right now, we're burning about $6 billion a day. 40,000 federal employees are gone. We covered 1 day of borrowing. And guess what? You absolutely are going to need to do things like that. But don't act like you just solved the U.S. debt problem. It's dozens and dozens of these things you have to stack up. So let's actually have a little bit more. I'm trying to tone down the sarcasm because we got to do these things. Let's get rid of foreign aid. You just covered 1 week of borrowing. Can't tell you how many times I'm at home and people say, if we just didn't have foreign aid, we could balance the budget. It's a week of borrowing. U.S. will waste billions of dollars on the United Nations. Okay, get rid of the United Nations. It's 2 days of borrowing. Let's take a look here. The U.S. spends too much on the Smithsonian and national parks. Okay, so if we're borrowing $6 billion a day and the Smithsonian costs $1 billion a year, you basically just cover what, 4 hours? Okay, maybe you don't want the museums. Maybe you want to create entrance fees. Well, you want to do something else. But don't act like you just balance the budget by doing something like that. Let's do another one. Cutting congressional salaries would solve the deficit. Look, we're probably overpaid for the quality of our work. But if you're borrowing $6 billion a day, and you do that, you basically, if you got rid of congressional salaries, I think it's 20 minutes for an entire year. So take an entire year of borrowing, you just covered 20 minutes. Stop saying crazy stuff. You know, these are serious problems. Maybe we need serious people to start actually thinking about these things. So let's take a look at another one. The government spends billions on unused federal office buildings. Absolutely, we need to clean this up. And it would be about, let's see, 6 hours, maybe 7 hours of borrowing. Get rid of all those unused office space, which we should do. Absolutely need to do that. But it's like 6 or 7 hours worth of borrowing because we're burning over $6 billion every single day. Am I making a point? Are you starting to understand the scale of what members of Congress have to take on? And these trite little sound bites don't get you anywhere. Cutting funding to NPR, PBS, and the National Endowment of the Arts would save billions. Cover 4 hours. 4 hours of borrowing. You know, maybe you should. Maybe you should actually turn those into public trust, let the public pay other than taxpayers, have them fundraise, fine. But don't act like you just solved the national debt problem. It's 4 hours of borrowing. Let's do one or two more, get this off my chest. Presidential travel. This was one of the Democrats was going after President Trump. Okay, all the presidential travel was like $350 billion. So you got an hour, 0.4. Yep, about an hour, 0.4. So, less than 2 hours for an entire year's worth of borrowing. Let's have one or two more fun just because I have them done. Department of Education salaries. Let's just get rid of the Department of Education salaries. Yay! You covered 9 hours of borrowing. Okay, how about another one? Emergency services for undocumented. These are people here illegally. They walk into hospitals. They get a federal subsidy. Okay, let's make it so it just becomes uncompensated care of the hospital. Fine. You covered 9 hours of borrowing for an entire year. The reality of it It's not these crazy little trite things. Yes, they're problems. And there may be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars out there, which we need to crush and get rid of. We're going to borrow about $2.3 trillion this year. And in 10 years, that number is up dramatically. And it's demographics. If you look at the 30-year data, everything that's in the federal budget except Medicare and Social Security actually is designed to grow slower than tax receipts. We modeled that in 30 years, we'll have about $9 trillion surplus, as we had counted. It grows slower than tax receipts. Medicare and Social Security, my math is actually much more dour, but this board is like a year and a half, 2 years old. It's probably about $116 trillion in spend and interest. We can make this work. You can do this without cutting our brothers and sisters' benefits. But you gotta be willing to think disruptively. You gotta be willing to think creatively. You gotta be willing to think morally. You gotta be willing to think of how do we modernize the world around us. What would happen if you could change the cost of delivering services to our brothers and sisters by getting rid of the archaic designs of many of these programs? Look, my 2-year-old is somewhere in the back, and yes, I have a 2-year-old. My wife's exactly my age. And we adopted a little girl years ago, and same birth mom, the phone rang, so I have a little person. When my 2-year-old, and I've said this repeatedly, but I'm trying to have it break through. Is there anyone out there that thinks morally? When my 2-year-old is basically 22, 23 years old, every U.S. tax has to be doubled just to maintain baseline services. The math is very clear, and it's left math, right math. Every economist who's honest basically says, my kids, your grandkids, are going to be part of the first generation to actually be poorer than their parents and grandparents. That's not America. This was the country of aspiration. We were the ones that we always knew we were leaving the next generation an opportunity to be more prosperous. And it can be that way. But it can only be that way if this place stops acting like intellectual children. The bedwetting, I'm sorry, I take that back, Mr. Speaker. The fear, just the fear of going home and explaining to our constituents the truth. You see how the Democrats are acting right now just by data scientists digging through and looking for perversities in the data sets. You would think there would have been joy. Because those aren't cutting services. Those are finding people who are exploiting you, taking advantage of your country. But because it's being done by President Trump, it must be opposed. How do you fix things? How do you save Social Security? How do you save Medicare? How do you save the future when it's not a loyal opposition anymore? It's basically anything to burn the place down to take power. And for anyone who's really doesn't have a life and has watched this presentation, I beg of you, get good at the math. Stop making crap up. Because if you get good at the math, it provides us the opportunity to have the building blocks to actually produce a solution. There's hopes. There's ways it works. We also have some economic data that basically says if we don't do it within about the next 4 years and interest rates start to move against us, we're in for a long, slow rest of the century. And that's worth thinking about, because the debt starts piling and piling. Remember, in the previous year, I think we had 3 months where we had to borrow money to pay for our borrowing. For every dime we will take in tax collections this year, we're going to spend $1, I think it's $1.36, which is an improvement. Last year was $1.39. It doesn't have to be this way. We just have to start telling the truth. Tell the truth about the math, tell the truth to each other, and toughen up. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.